Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment. Your support helps the channel grow. Boston in the early 1960s was a city caught between its past and its future. It was a place still guided by old-world traditions, with brick neighborhoods, tight-knit ethnic communities, and a civic identity built on its revolutionary heritage. Yet at the same time, it was entering a decade of rapid modernization and social upheaval, changes in politics, culture, gender roles, and urban life. The city was expanding, shifting, and redefining itself, like much of America. That transitional moment, fragile and uncertain, would become the backdrop for one of the most notorious crime waves in U.S. history. By 1962, Boston was simultaneously modern and provincial. Its population was just over 600,000, spread across neighborhoods that felt like small towns. Many women lived alone, often elderly widows in modest apartments across the Back Bay, Fenway, Beacon Hill, and Roxbury areas. The city had a reputation for intellectualism, Catholic conservatism, and local pride, not violent crime. Boston was not Chicago or New York. Homicide rates were relatively low. Crimes that did occur were often domestic, not predatory. Yet beneath this fade of safety, several deeper currents were shaping the city's vulnerability. One major factor was urban demographic change. Younger families were moving to the suburbs, leaving behind an aging population in the city's core. These older residents often lived in outdated buildings with inadequate locks, loose security standards, and minimal surveillance. Many apartments had shared hallways, unsecured entrances, and landlords slow to update safety measures. Women who lived alone were often known by neighbors and building staff, a fact that, in retrospect, made them easier targets. A second factor was that women in the early 1960s were only beginning to live independently in large numbers. No one imagined that a man could walk into their home in broad daylight and kill them without signs of forced entry. Crime reporting was less centralized, police communication slower, and interagency collaboration inconsistent. Detectives often worked in isolation, relying heavily on intuition rather than coordinated forensic methodology. Finally, the city's police departments, divided into precincts with separate command structures, lacked the modern tools that would become standard later in the decade. There were no DNA tests, limited fiber analysis, and primitive fingerprint systems compared to today. Even the concept of a serial killer had not yet fully developed in American criminology. The idea that one offender might commit a series of murders across district lines simply was not the default assumption of investigators. All these loose threads, aging residents, weak building security, changing social norms, and outdated police methods, created an environment where a predator could move undetected. The terror began on June 14, 1962. The victim was 55-year-old Anna Slezers, a seamstress of Latvian origin who lived in a small apartment on Park Drive in the Fenway neighborhood. Her son discovered her body when he came to visit. She had been strangled with the cord of her bathrobe, tied in a distinctive bow. There were no signs of forced entry. The apartment showed no major struggle. At first, the police treated the murder as an isolated tragedy, possibly a sexual homicide, although Slezers had not been raped. The lack of sexual assault but presence of sexual staging was baffling and contradictory, a pattern that would soon appear again. The media reported the case briefly, without sensationalism. Boston had no reason to believe that this murder was anything more than an aberration. Just 2 weeks later, on June 30, 1962, the second victim was found. 68-year-old Nina Nichols, a physiotherapist living in Cambridge. She, too, was strangled with a ligature, a pair of her own stockings tied in a bow. As in the first case, there were no signs of forced entry. Later that same day, across the Charles River in Lynn, a third victim was discovered. 65-year-old Helen Blake. She had also been strangled, partially undressed, and left with a ligature tied in the same distinctive fashion. Now the pattern was undeniable. 3 older women, living alone. Strangulation using their own belongings. No forced entry. Sexual overtones without rape. The signature bow. All in the span of 16 days. This was something Boston had never faced. In July and August of 1962, newspapers began linking the cases, though official police statements remained restrained. The Boston Globe, the Record American, and the Herald pushed the narrative that a single killer was attacking elderly women. Headlines used phrases like Phantom Strangler and Mad Strangler of Boston, stirring anxiety in a city unused to random violence. Women began placing wooden bars against their doors, buying new locks, and installing chains. Hardware stores reported massive spikes in sales. The social fabric of Boston shifted overnight. Neighbors who had trusted one another for decades began double-checking who knocked before opening their doors. Fear spread not through sensational hysteria, but through grim realism. These murders were not happening at night in dark alleys. They were occurring inside homes, in broad daylight, and leaving no clue as to how the killer entered. That was the detail that terrorized residents most. People wondered, was he impersonating a repairman? Was he following women from the market? Did he simply bluff his way in with charm? Or did he pick locks with expertise? Boston police, along with the Attorney General's office, began forming unofficial task forces, but coordination was still fragmented. Detectives circulated through elderly neighborhoods, warning women not to let strangers in. But these warnings contained an assumption that the killer was using deceit or coercion to gain entry. They did not yet consider the possibility that the victims might have voluntarily let him in because he appeared harmless, an assumption that would become central to later theories. Crime scene investigators found almost nothing consistent except the ligature bow. Fingerprints were smudged, partial, or useless. No clear footprints or usable fibers were collected. The killer seemed to wipe surfaces clean or avoid touching most areas entirely. He left no note, no traceable pattern of movement, and no apparent motive. The idea that Boston was facing a criminal with method and control, a man who could walk into a stranger's apartment and leave without being seen, was slowly taking form. In late 1962, as the year progressed into autumn, the killer deviated from the pattern. Previously, all victims were elderly women, mostly over 55. But on December 5, 1962, 20-year-old student Sophie Clark was murdered in her apartment. She was young, African American, and living with roommates in an urban area with frequent visitors. Her murder shattered the assumptions investigators had been relying on. Sophie Clark had been strangled with her own stockings, tied in the unmistakable bow. The staging of the body was similar to earlier cases, but she did not fit the victim profile at all. This forced detectives to reconsider. Was the killer changing preferences? Did he choose targets of opportunity rather than a specific demographic? Or was a copycat at work? A week later, on December 31, 1962, 23-year-old Patricia Bissett was murdered. She was pregnant and worked as a receptionist. She, too, was strangled in the same ritualistic manner. The age range of victims had expanded dramatically. Now the killer could be anyone's threat, not only elderly women living alone, but young adults as well. By early 1963, Boston's police, government, and citizens were in a crisis. The media coverage intensified. Residents developed routines that became part of daily life. Checking in on neighbors, watching hallways for unfamiliar men, questioning service workers, double-locking doors behind them. For women living alone, simple activities, answering the door, climbing the stairs to their apartment, opening windows, became sources of dread. The city's patriarchal attitude also influenced police behavior. Some officers implied that women should not be living alone, or that the victims were careless for opening their doors. Such attitudes frustrated female residents and did little to improve safety. Still, the killer operated with impunity. There was no sign of forced entry at the vast majority of crime scenes. Doors were intact, locks unbroken, windows secure. Several theories circulated. He pretended to be a maintenance worker or deliverman. He was let in voluntarily because he seemed polite or harmless. He used skillful lockpicking, or he followed women into shared buildings and chose unlocked doors. No single explanation fit all cases. This inconsistency would later become crucial in debates over whether one man committed all the murders. In 1962, criminal profiling was still in its infancy. Boston detectives consulted psychologists informally, trying to understand the killer's behavior. Early profiles suggested a white male, early 20s to mid-30s, intelligent and articulate, likely familiar with hospitals, maintenance work, or home visits, possibly someone with sexual dysfunction or voyeuristic tendencies, and someone who blended in easily and appeared non-threatening. These descriptions, although vague, would later resemble one of the major suspects. At the end of this early period, Boston had already witnessed 7 brutal murders attributed to the same unknown assailant. The pattern was evolving, the victim pool widening, and the killer's boldness increasing. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no confessions. Nothing tangible tied the murders together except the chillingly similar ligatures. Boston's identity, its sense of community, security, and tradition, was collapsing under the weight of anxiety. The city was no longer a place where people simply lived. It had become a city constantly looking over its shoulder, checking its locks, and fearing the sound of a knock at the door. The autumn of 1962 brought colder weather to Boston, but it did little to cool the anxiety surrounding the city. By this point, the Boston Strangler had become more than a local threat. He was a specter discussed nationwide in newspapers and national broadcasts. Boston households that once left doors unlocked throughout the day began installing deadbolts and chains. Hardware stores reported surges in sales of locks, window bars, and alarm devices. A social transformation took place in the very fabric of daily life. Despite heightened awareness and increased caution, the killings did not stop. Instead, they changed in a way that confounded investigators and widened the scope of fear. Up until this point, all of the Stranglers' confirmed victims had been older women. The police felt they had some grasp on what the killer was doing, even if they could not catch him. They assumed he targeted vulnerable elderly women, perhaps due to personal trauma or a deep-seated resentment associated with older maternal figures. But then the pattern broke. On December 31, 1962, the body of 21-year-old Sophie Clark was discovered in her apartment. She was young, vibrant, and living with roommates. Unlike the previous victims, Clark was young, healthy, and physically strong. There was no clear reason to consider her vulnerable. Yet she had been strangled with her own stockings, posed, and left with the same ritualistic bow-tied ligature seen in earlier cases. Her apartment showed no signs of forced entry. This development forced investigators to reassess the entire investigation. The murder of a young woman in her early 20s shattered the illusion that only elderly women were at risk. College campuses across Boston issued warnings, advising female students not to open their doors under any circumstances unless absolutely certain of the visitor's identity. Dormitories implemented sign-in policies. Parents of students living off-campus demanded increased security patrols and urged their daughters to return home. Community meetings doubled in frequency. Boston police received more than 1,000 phone calls in the weeks following Clark's murder, calls ranging from reports of suspicious men to requests for safety checks on elderly relatives. Many of the tips were well-intentioned but ultimately unproductive, straining police resources. Psychological fear began to manifest in unusual ways. Women reported feeling watched even inside their own apartments. Some refused to shower unless a friend or family member was home. Others slept with lights on throughout the night. Sales of firearms rose as some residents sought to arm themselves. Self-defense classes began forming spontaneously in community centers and church basements. In certain neighborhoods, vigilante groups emerged. While police did not condone these groups, they recognized that fear was driving people to take security into their own hands. The city was becoming tense, jittery, and hyper-aware, yet still essentially powerless to stop an unseen predator. Barely a month after Sophie Clark's murder, the body of 23-year-old Patricia Bissett was found on January 4, 1963, in her Beacon Street apartment. Bissett's death bore the signature hallmarks of the Strangler pattern. Strangulation, use of the victim's own clothing as a ligature, a bow tied in a precise fashion, no forced entry, and a controlled crime scene. However, Bissett's case also contained details that raised new questions. Her body showed signs of sexual assault in a way that earlier cases had not consistently displayed. Investigators began to consider whether the killer was gaining confidence and refining his method, or whether the earlier absence of physical evidence had been the result of poor forensic technology rather than a real difference. Throughout the first half of 1963, media coverage became increasingly aggressive. Newspapers published speculative articles, some based on anonymous sources within the police department. Reporters sought out neighbors, co-workers, relatives, anyone who could provide quotes or opinions about the victim's final days. While some coverage was responsible and factual, other reporting veered toward sensationalism, emphasizing lurid details that stoked fear and fueled rumor. Amateur detectives across Boston began conducting their own informal investigations, supplying police with theories, some thoughtful, others absurd. The influx of tips, while occasionally useful, often buried detectives under irrelevant information. In May 1963, the Strangler case took another disturbing turn with the murder of 23-year-old Beverly Salmons, a medical student living in Cambridge. Unlike earlier victims, Salmons was not strangled with a ligature alone. She had been stabbed multiple times in the neck and chest, although strangulation also appeared to have occurred. This divergence from the established method prompted new debate. Was this the same killer or a copycat? Some detectives argued that the presence of both stabbing and strangulation suggested an attempt to experiment or escalate. Others believed the stabbing was too great a departure from previous methods and could not have been executed by the same individual. The ritualistic bow was absent. The crime scene was more chaotic. And yet, the victim profile, young, female, living alone, still aligned with the evolving pattern. The police faced a dilemma. If they continued linking every unusual murder of a woman to the strangler, they risked clouding the case with false connections. But if they dismissed cases prematurely, they might overlook critical evidence. By the end of 1963, Boston had endured elderly victims, young victims, a mix of strangulation and stabbing, geographic expansion, shifts in victim demographics, and variations in crime scene staging. This inconsistency made it increasingly difficult to maintain a coherent investigative strategy. Were these truly the acts of one man? Or had the fame of the Boston Strangler spawned imitators, opportunists, or individuals committing unrelated murders with similar methods? These questions divided detectives, journalists, and criminologists alike. In October 1964, a series of unrelated sexual assault cases in Cambridge led police to arrest a man named Albert DeSalvo, a 33-year-old handyman with a troubled personal history. DeSalvo was known to police for a previous string of non-lethal sexual offenses. In one series of incidents, he had gained notoriety as the Measuring Man, a perpetrator who approached women under the pretense of being a talent scout and then assaulted them after convincing them to allow him to measure their bodies. Later, in a more aggressive pattern, he became known as the Green Man, responsible for multiple violent assaults on women across several states. These crimes involved tying and restraining victims, often with materials found within their homes. During his incarceration for the sexual assault charges, DeSalvo began to speak with a fellow inmate, George Nassar, a convicted murderer known for his intelligence and manipulative tendencies. Nassar later claimed that DeSalvo confided in him about being the Boston Strangler. According to Nassar, DeSalvo expressed a desire to confess but hoped to profit from a book deal or financial arrangement that might support his family after his imprisonment. The credibility of Nassar's account remains a matter of debate, but his involvement played a pivotal role in what happened next. In November 1964, DeSalvo voluntarily confessed to being the Boston Strangler. His confession stunned law enforcement. Few had suspected that one man alone could be responsible for such a wide variety of murder styles, especially given the shifts in victimology and method over the 2-year period. Yet DeSalvo provided detailed accounts of the crime scenes, the victims, and the manner in which the crimes were committed, details that were not publicly known. He described entering victims' apartments using various ruses, posing as a maintenance worker, a deliveryman, or a handyman. He explained how he tied the characteristic bow, and he told investigators he used items found within the victims' homes as ligatures to avoid bringing incriminating materials with him. His recollection of crime scene layouts, victim clothing, and the sequence of events appeared accurate in multiple instances. These details persuaded several investigators that they had, at last, found the Boston Strangler. However, DeSalvo's confession was not recorded under formal interrogation, and no physical evidence linked him to the murders. His confession was given to psychiatrists and lawyers, rather than the police themselves. Furthermore, DeSalvo had a documented history of seeking attention and validation. His desire for fame, combined with the influence of fellow inmates, raised the possibility that he might be confessing falsely in exchange for promises of financial gain for his family. Because Massachusetts did not have the death penalty, DeSalvo may have also believed that confessing to the murders would not result in execution, making a sensational confession less risky. His attorney, F. Lee Bailey, who would later become one of America's most well-known defense lawyers, believed that a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity might succeed if DeSalvo could convince a jury of his involvement in the infamous killings. Yet, despite the dramatic nature of the confession, the state did not charge DeSalvo with any of the Strangler murders. Instead, he was tried and convicted for his earlier sexual assault crimes, receiving a life sentence. The decision not to prosecute him for the murders was influenced by the lack of physical evidence and the legal complications surrounding his confession, which had not been obtained through official investigative procedures. This decision marked one of the most controversial moments of the entire case. From the moment DeSalvo confessed, the Boston Strangler case entered a new phase, one marked by intense debate, conflicting opinions, and enduring uncertainty. Several investigators, journalists, and criminologists accepted DeSalvo's confession as authentic. They pointed to the accuracy of his details and his demonstrated capacity for violent sexual offenses. They also noted that after his incarceration, the murders attributed to the Strangler stopped. However, many others expressed doubts, some of which persist today. Critics raised inconsistencies in the confession, no physical evidence linking him to any crime scene, variation in MO, possibility of multiple killers, and questions about DeSalvo's psychological profile. These concerns led many to believe that DeSalvo may have been responsible for some, but not all, of the murders, or perhaps none at all. After his conviction, DeSalvo remained in prison and was later transferred to Bridgewater State Hospital for the criminally insane. He spent the remainder of his life attempting to gain attention for his story, offering confessions, and writing letters. On November 25, 1973, at the age of 42, Albert DeSalvo was stabbed to death by another inmate at Walpole State Prison. His death prevented any further legal closure or prosecution for the Strangler murders. For decades, the question of his guilt remained controversial. It was not until 2013, 40 years after his death, that DNA testing definitively linked DeSalvo to one of the Boston Strangler's victims, Mary Sullivan, the last known victim, murdered in 1964. Advanced forensic techniques matched DNA from DeSalvo's living relatives to biological material found at the crime scene. While this confirmed that he was at least one of the killers, debate persists regarding the full scope of his responsibility. Some researchers suggest that more than one person may have committed the murders, pointing to variations in method and victim selection. Nevertheless, DeSalvo is officially recognized as the Boston Strangler in historical and legal records, and his case remains a landmark in the study of serial crime, forensic investigation, and criminal psychology. The Boston Strangler killings left an indelible mark on the city. Neighborhoods once characterized by trust and community solidarity became more cautious, and personal security became a constant concern for Boston residents. The case influenced policing strategies, forensic methods, and the understanding of serial murder in America. It highlighted the vulnerability of women living alone in urban environments, exposed limitations in investigative procedures, and ultimately became a defining example of the complexities surrounding confessions, evidence, and public perception in high-profile criminal cases. To this day, the Strangler remains a symbol of fear, manipulation, and the capacity for violence to infiltrate the most intimate spaces of human life.